And talk about politics seems to be making its way into some classrooms. A couple of viral videos show how a college professor and even a fifth grade teacher have talked to their students about the 2020 elections. NTD's Melina Weiskup brings us more.
A Suffolk County Community College student recorded her humanities professor talking poorly about President Trump during class.
Well, he's had 4 friggin' years of a chance, and he's done a crap job, and he's really ruining our country. Many of you, this may be the first time that you're voting. I'm sorry it's such a contentious situation that you're being thrusted into. If any of you do still think Trump is a good person, I beg you to not only go into your heart center and think about this a little more, pull up all the stuff that he's been doing.
She went on to say that Trump is turning America into a dictator type of situation. We asked the professor for a comment, but she did not immediately get back to us. The college said they do not condone electioneering by faculty in the classroom. The student, Jessica Salvatore, spoke up about the issue, which led to the professor's reassignment.
I would never succumb to that. If something's not right, I will speak up on it, and I encourage other people to do the same thing.
Jessica tells us some of her classmates thanked her for speaking up because they felt uncomfortable too. She says she wasn't surprised that this happened, given the general environment on campus.
Yeah, this one student I spoke to actually got a failing grade because he wrote from his conservative perspective instead of a liberal one. It's not an uncommon thing to see, which is sad.
And her father tells us he's disappointed because he calls the move an attempt to make his daughter feel less than a good person for not sharing the same views as the professor.
I don't think it was fair for this teacher to tell her, you need to look inside your heart. What, is she not as much of a human being as you are? You're a better person than us? That's ridiculous.
He says that college should be a place to teach students how to think for themselves, not what to think. And we also found that talk about politics has even gotten into a fifth grade classroom.
If Biden gets elected, we'll have a woman vice president, and that's one chair away from president. I'd like to see a woman president.
The comments on the video showed that this occurred during a gifted history class at an elementary school in Florida. A grandmother posted this video on September 10th, and the anonymous source that shared it tells us Facebook has since deleted it. Reporting by Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
A new study shows that Joe Biden's budget may lead to a $2 trillion increase in the federal deficit over the next 10 years. Biden's plan includes the highest levels of government spending in decades. Our reporter Kevin Hogan spoke with an economist about the impact Biden's budget would have on working Americans.
According to a study published this week by the Penn Wharton budget model, Biden's budget would increase federal spending by over $5 trillion over the next decade, but only collect $3.4 trillion in new tax revenue. The study says that although it would put the U.S. into greater debt in the next 10 years, Biden's plan would decrease federal debt by 2050. The analysis shows that about half of the tax revenue will come from corporations. Progressives argue big shot investors will bear the brunt and thus the wealthy will lose money. Yet economist Thomas Hogan explains that investors can easily take their money elsewhere, which means the workers take the hit.
It's hard to pass on that cost of higher taxes to consumers. It ends up falling largely on employees. It's harder for an employee to move to another company, and so the tax increase largely gets passed on to workers, and so you have this.
The study expects Biden's budget would lead to an increase in the federal deficit by $2 trillion over the next 10 years. A deficit leads to an increase in federal debt, because when there's a shortfall, the government has to borrow money by selling government bonds. More debt inevitably means more taxes, and as Hogan explains, this leaves less money for companies to invest in their businesses and hire new workers.
The government's going to be borrowing more, and that is less money that is flowing to private businesses that are going to be able to expand their businesses and hire new workers. So it's bad for people in terms of having fewer jobs and lower wages, and it's also bad for investors that are potentially going to earn lower rates of return on their investments.
At the end of 2019, the federal debt was just over $20 trillion, about the same amount as the U.S.'s GDP. Biden's budget is expected to increase the national debt by about 10% by 2030. Hogan explains that if the U.S.'s debt becomes too big, investors may be afraid the debt can't be paid off, and so they may be less likely to invest in the U.S. and could move their money into other countries.
So we have the advantage that foreigners are more willing to invest in the United States, but that won't last forever. As our debt continues to increase, it makes it more likely in the future that we might potentially have to default or face a situation where we might have to drastically cut spending very quickly rather than trying to keep it at a sustainable level over time.
Biden's campaign did not immediately respond to a request for comment. As a percentage of GDP, the U.S. debt has not been at the height it is now since the end of World War II. Kevin Hogan, NTD News, New York.
One senior Chinese tech engineer says China's biggest problem is its lack of press freedom. Through its clever use of propaganda, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, aims to present an all-powerful front. In our part 3 of this interview, we dive into the mechanisms of the CCP's media control.
William Guo has been working as a senior Alibaba technician in China for 2.5 years. He specializes in the company's Ali Cloud technology for overseas clients and is a top expert in the industry. In his eyes, China's lack of press freedom has allowed its communist rule to run wild. Along the same line, the CCP doesn't allow the Chinese people to believe in the divine, instead casting itself as a god worthy of reverence. Guo says he considers many of the CCP's tactics to be quite scary. He mentioned the regime's use of digital currencies as an example. He pointed out the regime has the ability to work with the central bank to manipulate individual accounts. That makes zeroing out a citizen's assets as easy as deleting a computer document.
Before, if someone takes your money away, then it's no longer your money. Nowadays, they don't need to take your money, so it's still on your account. But it's not your money anymore. Then what's left for the Chinese people?
According to Guo, the older generation better understands the risk of losing their savings. That's because their previous suffering serves as a reminder. He says their experiences come from having their property taken by the CCP or seeing their family starve to death. Guo explained that his uncle died of starvation during what's known as the Great Chinese Famine about 60 years ago. His uncle was one of 30 million people who died, but it's hard for them to stand up because of fear.
Despite brutal suppression from the CCP, Chinese people can still tell good from bad. The only thing is the CCP has guns, so any attempts to fight back will be ruthlessly crushed.
The CCP controls the masses by controlling Chinese media and markets. Guo brought up a project conducted by an acquaintance. It involves simply collecting news released by state-run media during the CCP virus pandemic. But even something as simple as that is not allowed. He was later arrested in Beijing as a result and still hasn't been granted a lawyer.
If the CCP made up the news, there must have been inconsistencies. This happened during the pandemic. There were many inconsistencies. So they have to fix these problems, and the only way to do it is by deleting the news articles. That's what we see, the 404s, the not found.
In addition to attempts to erase the past, another of the regime's common techniques is to control people's ability to make a living.
The regime knows how to intensively and effectively control you, to deprive you of freedom. It won't allow you to acquire too many skills that would allow you to make a living on your own. So there is a lack of free market economy.
Guo says that compared to Americans, Chinese people generally lack necessary job skills and training. Limited abilities can lead to less instability down the road, as the job market changes and demand for certain talents increases or decreases. It often prompts increased dependence on the government, a pain Guo says is felt by many, but that no one dares to speak up about. Reporting by Xu Wenhui, NTD News.